Hi, so I'm Eloise Sacares. I'm a researcher at the Fabian Society, and I'm going to be chairing this panel on the left's agenda for the environment. So I lead our work on climate and environment policy, which is obviously a hugely important issue that the world is currently facing. And we can see the impacts that climate change is having both in the UK, but also across the world. And the Tories are failing to act quick enough to prevent further warming to our planet. The government just this week have been accused by their own appointed net zero SAR of failing to keep their environmental promises in almost every area of policy, and we need to be doing better. We are facing an energy crisis of a huge scale, in part due to the government's failure to create enough renewable energy. It's been hampered by constant government U-turns. And we are also facing issues in our natural environment, such as the sewage dumping that's been going on across the summer, putting sewage from storm overflows into our seas and rivers, making them dangerous and unsafe for us to swim in. So that's just a few of the issues that Labour, if they win the next election, are going to need to tackle, and that's what we're here to discuss today. Ed and also Rachel this morning have set out some of this, but there's still a lot to discuss. So that's what our brilliant panel who are here today are going to be talking about. So our panellists are Ed Miliband MP, who is the Shadow Secretary of State for Climate Change and Net Zero. We also have Shaun Spiers, who is the Executive Director of the Green Alliance, Councillor Dr. Kindy Sandhu, who is a Cabinet Member for Education and Skills at Coventry City Council. On my left, we have Polly Billington, Chief Executive Officer of UK 100, and then we have Fiona Harvey, Environment Editor of The Guardian. So to start off, I'm going to ask for some opening remarks from Ed Miliband. Ed is the Labour MP for Doncaster North and the Shadow Secretary of State for Climate Change and Net Zero. When Labour was last in government, he served as the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change from 2008 to 2010 under Gordon Brown's administration, and many of you will also know him as a previous leader of the Labour Party. So over to you, Ed.
Great. Well, look, thank you very much, Eloise, and thank you to all of you for staying. There's lots of other things you could do on a Saturday afternoon. Thank you for choosing to spend it with us to talk about this crucial issue, and it's a great panel to be on. Now, we've been told that we've got 4 minutes each to speak, and I'm sure we're all going to breach that time limit, but we'll try not to breach it by too much. Let me make one introductory point, and then I've got a few other things to say. First, you heard from Rachel in her excellent speech this morning the issue of the climate and nature crisis and what we do and how we can change it in government and tackle it in government and what the implications of it are absolutely central to what Labour is saying. And I think it is absolutely brilliant that both Cllr and Rachel are both so kind of engaged and putting this agenda front and centre. And I think, genuinely, I don't think this has happened before in a political party. I obviously blame former leaders for that. But, to have the leader, the Shadow Chancellor, as well as someone like myself talking about this issue and saying what we're going to do and making it central to the tests we will apply in government, I think is incredibly important. And I'll just make this point. Obviously, it's very important that Cllr talks about it, but the Treasury has been a massive block on action on this. So, I'm just sort of incredibly pleased that Rachel has made it so much front and centre of what she is doing. The main thing I want to say is this, which is, we will win the next election with a narrative of hope, not despair. And I think if we're honest about this issue, there's lots of reasons to despair, but we need to be the people for hope. And not false hope, not sort of waffly optimism, but real optimism about what we can do with the country. And I think we can centre that narrative of hope around 4 propositions. And I just want to talk about each of those briefly. First, it's cheaper to save the planet than to destroy it. And this is an incredibly important argument that we need to be making, and it is really what puts the whole right-wing net zero Steve Baker crowd in an impossible position, because they are not just making the morally wrong argument, they are making the economically wrong argument as well. I'm sure you've heard this figure that renewables this summer were 9 times cheaper than fossil fuels. You know, by saying no to onshore wind, by blocking solar power, by doing all of those things that the government is doing, they are saying no to cheaper energy for people. Second point, we're in the better lives business, not the hair shirt business. And, you know, the way we talk about our green prosperity plan is we say lower bills, energy security, jobs, and tackling the climate crisis. Why? And we make no apology for this. We want to build the broadest possible coalition for this agenda. And there are lots and lots of people who care most about climate, and I think we have great things to say to them about our climate leadership. 2030, zero carbon electricity system, first major country in the world to do that, no to new fossil fuel licenses, insulating 19 million cold drafty homes, GB Energy, publicly owned energy company, the National Wealth Fund. So, and that is about climate leadership, but that is also about answering the cry of economic pain that we've heard consistently across this country for a decade or more. Good jobs, decent wages, you know, real tackling of regional inequality. And what I'm going to be doing, I'm on a GB Energy tour at the moment, going around the country. I was in Crawley yesterday at a place called Naked Energy, not what it sounds like, which does solar thermal heating. And I'm going to be going all around the country talking about this message because we know that GB Energy is a massive vote winner for us. When people hear about GB Energy, I was on doorstep in Crawley yesterday, and this guy said to me, lifelong Tory voter, I'm not voting for this miserable shower of, then he said another word, and he said, what we really need is some public ownership of our energy system. And I said, thank you for asking, sir. GB Energy. He said, well, that sounds like a great idea. Not enough people know about that yet, so I'm going to be going around the country talking about it. And this is about, it's also about the nature crisis. It's about cleaner air. It's about green spaces. It's about jobs. It's about bills. It's about tackling fuel poverty. So that's the second point. Thirdly, this is not my phrase, but it is a great phrase from the American writer Rebecca Solnit, and she's written a book about this, and she's got a website. The phrase is, it's not too late. I think this is really important, but I think there is a tendency to despair and a tendency to say, look, we can see the climate crisis all around us, maybe there's just nothing we can do anymore. And I think particularly for young people, but it's true generally, it's not correct to say it's too late to act. There's all kinds of things we can do. And if you think about the potential of a Labour government, not just domestically, but internationally, Cllr was at Davos in the last couple of days talking about this idea of a clean power alliance, first broken in The Guardian by my very good friend Fiona Harvey, which is all about the idea that we collaborate with other countries that are committed to a zero carbon electricity system. And if you think about OPEC, they manage oil and gas production to keep prices high. By going hell for leather for renewables, we can drive prices down even further, because we've seen solar panels fall by 89% over a decade, but they can even fall further if we get together and deploy them. This is about the public sector, the private sector, business working together to make this happen. You know, there is a world to win, and we can win it. It doesn't mean to say that there aren't really serious issues of adaptation, really serious issues of what the developing world is facing, which we have to act on. But we mustn't succumb to the idea that there's just nothing we can do. We can throw up our hands and just sort of hide under the duvet, because that's in a way what the right want. That's one of their strategies. Well, it's all too late to do anything about it now. That's the third thing. Fourth and final point is, I'm interested in this idea of everybody in. And what do I mean by that? I mean everybody as part of this mission. I want, if I'm the Secretary of State for a new department for climate change and net zero, I obviously want government to be doing the right things on clean power and GB energy and so on. But this isn't going to work, and I'm very influenced by the work that Polly has done in this. This isn't going to work simply as a top-down government thing. This is about local authorities. It is about business. It is about community energy. It is about millions of people across the country being advocates on what can be done in their own communities. And I think in a way that's what's kind of exciting about this, which is, as I'm thinking about this new department, I want it to be not just a government department, but part of a movement. And it is the movement that can be sort of transformative. Yes, government has to pull the levers, do the right things, and we will do that. And it's going to be challenging and tough, but we can do it. And Rachel was talking about some of those issues this morning. But transformation will come from government and people working together. So I'll just sort of end by saying, you know, I think you get a sense at this conference of hope being in the air in a way that it hasn't been for a long time. I think we should embrace that hope. I think we should not shy away from truth-telling about the climate crisis and the nature crisis. We're going to have a lot more policy to come between now and the election, but we've also got to advocate for the policy that we've got at the moment. And I think this can help Labour win the election, change the country, and be climate leaders in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ed, for those remarks. It's so important, like you said, that we keep a message of hope rather than despair. And it's also really interesting to hear about how green policy isn't just about climate change, but about tackling lots of social issues together, and how every sort of part of society, business, communities, etc., need to work together. Now we are going to hear from Councillor Dr. Kindy Sandhu. Kindy is a research fellow at Coventry University and is also a councillor representing Earlsdon Ward on Coventry City Council. At Labour's 2022 party conference, she delivered a speech calling for greater diversity in the climate debate, which is something that's really important issue. So we're really glad to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for the invite from Fabian Society, and it's great to be on such a panel, I can tell you. But I would just want to first give a shout out to Fabian Women's Network. They've done so many panels today and sharing so many things. So as a former vice chair of Fabian Women's Network, it was incumbent on me to say that, and I really mean it. I just want to talk about two things today. It's basically my own reflections on the climate agenda as a woman of colour, and also as a former senior manager at a major blue chip international telecoms company, where we had to transition from narrowband to broadband technology. So I'm going to talk about both these things because I think they're often not talked about, and I just want to give some of my reflections on this as part of the climate agenda. So, if it's Labour's ambition to create a revolution in green jobs as a lever to stimulate essential economic growth, then the nature of the conversation, I believe, has to be adapted to include people, opportunity, and the workplace. We're a diverse nation, but I don't hear or see diversity in the climate agenda. But we need to be diverse, and I'm going to give some reasons why. I was someone who used to talk a lot about targeting messages, but I've changed my mind now. I think it's more about targeting dialogue that respects the reality of people's lives. Diasporic communities have a legacy of leaving families, the way of life that they've known, home, to build a better life in the UK. They come here because of reasons of conflict, war conflict, poverty, and often poverty that covers many generations of families. So it's important to demonstrate success, to show how the sacrifices one has made has been worth it. And often a marker of that success is material wealth. If you come from a legacy of poverty, and if coming to a Western society is deemed to be progress and status amongst your community, then you want to demonstrate that. And so, for example, historically, the perception of a 4x4 has traditionally been used as a symbol of success in diasporic communities, and certainly not huffing and puffing up a hill on a bike like I do. So dialogue has to focus on the links. Yes, we want to continue to be wealth creators, and a lot of that has been said today. But our response to the climate emergency demands that we grow our economy responsibly, and that as good global citizens we address unequal distribution locally, nationally and globally. I believe it's an opportunity Labour recognises that we mustn't squander. It's precisely because we have the strong links, whether it's family, friends, community, businesses across the globe, that we stand shoulder to shoulder with our fellow world citizens. And what we do to the climate, because of the material wealth that we have, has impacts on other parts of the world, and especially on our fellow citizens who live the kinds of lives tarnished by poverties that many of our ancestors from diasporic communities left behind. So the second part I want to talk about is what I experienced in industry. So when we focus on the green economy, we talk about STEM degrees, we talk about STEM skills, training, etc. In the company I used to work for, we employed graduates with language degrees because they had the analytical skills, they understood syntax, semantics, which is what you need when you're coding in any software language to produce software programs. We also put up adverts that said, "Did you fail your A-levels?" So that might sound a bit strange. And we put those adverts all over the country. And we interviewed young people to find out why they didn't succeed academically. The point of this was to ascertain their competencies. We knew they didn't have the skills, we knew they didn't have the qualifications, but we wanted to give them an opportunity to develop those precise things in skills and qualifications in technology, specifically telecoms. So that's my point. We focus on skills and qualifications, but we don't consider the competencies. So I see it as a supply chain to deliver growth from education, training, jobs, career, and policies to support people to not only access work equitably, but to stay in work. And that's why policies around childcare that should be part of an economical infrastructure are so important. So, for example, okay, just just going to finish. So, for example, if you're a partner, if you're someone who's fleeing domestic violence, right, and it's important that you stay in a job, how do we ensure that someone like that gets a job that we often see, gets the kind of job that we often see in posters and leaflets and booklets of a certain demographic with hard hats? Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Kindy. That was incredibly interesting. Next, we're going to hear from Shaun Spiers. Shaun Spiers is the Executive Director of Green Alliance, which is a think tank that focuses on green environmental climate change policy. Prior to this, he served as the Chief Executive of Campaign to Preserve Rural England for 13 years, and he was also an MEP for London South East. So over to you, Shaun. Also, sorry, I have been asked to keep people to time, so if you could be 4 minutes, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much. So on climate change, I think it's fair to say that Labour has great policies, great narrative, kind of owned from the top down, which hasn't always been the case, and it's great to hear Cllr and Rachel speak about that. That doesn't mean that NGOs won't be challenging for more, of course, and I think there's a lot of work to be done to get those policies in place across departments. It's going to have to be a whole government effort to meet the UK's climate targets, and that means a lot of work in the Department of Transport, Trade, Levelling Up, MOD even, etc., etc. So there's a lot of work to be done there. But the narrative and the policies are in a good place. So what I want to concentrate on is the other aspect of the environment, as it were, more the DEFRA brief, and the other part of the crisis we face. We've got a climate crisis, we've also got a nature crisis. So there are a lot of policies in that area. Ed's mentioned a couple of them, policies on water, air, planning and green spaces, circular economy, etc., etc. But I think I'd focus on two aspects where I think Labour needs to do more to challenge the government, and they are, firstly, just the sense that Labour cares about local environmental quality, landscapes, nature, the things that these mean for people's lives. Labour's got a great legacy there, even in the last Labour government. The last two national parks that were created, New Forest and South Downs, were created by Labour secretaries of state. All the stuff on the right to roam. But I think we've lost that sense that leading Labour figures have this kind of in their heart. You know, John Smith's commitment to the right to roam, Robin Cook climbing the Munros, etc. It's a pity we're not in the Ada Salter room, just around the corner. Ada Salter, Women's Labour League and a member of the ILP, who said the cultivation of flowers and trees is a civic duty. And quite deep in Labour's tradition from Ruskin and William Morris and so on was a sense that nature was really a life-enhancing and something that could be good for everyone. And I think we just need to recover that. And Green Lions, and before Green Lions at CPRE, we've tried for years to get a Labour leader to say something about it, just nod in their leader's speech to caring about this, to sort of speak to people who kind of watch Spring Watch or enjoy walking or whatever. We may not try with you, Ed. You may have done. I can't remember. But anyway, I think that's something I'd like to Labour to focus on more. But the other thing is that, and I think Extinction Rebellion were really, really clear on this in 2019, is we face a twin crisis, nature and climate, and you can't solve one without the other. So not only is it about people's quality of life, it is existential. The government commissioned Partha Dasgupta to do a report on the economics of nature, to be the sort of nature equivalent of the Stern report. He said the world was at extreme risk from the depletion of nature. The IPBES, the UN equivalent of the International Panel on Climate Change, says the health of the ecosystems on which we and other species depend is deteriorating more rapidly than ever. We are eroding the very foundations of economic livelihoods, food security, health and quality of life worldwide. We must act now. And it talked about 1 million species at risk. Yeah. Now, the UK government, the current government, has actually, to give it credit, been more vocal about the nature side of the environment equation than most governments, and actually put it on the agenda at COP26. It's the delivery that I think is a sort of open goal for Labour. Last week, the Office for Environmental Protection produced its report on how the government was delivering the 25-year environment plan. 23 environmental targets, 7 off track, 7 significantly off track, and 9 they're unable to say because there's not the data. So you can have all the kind of aspirations and policies in the world, but it's quite clear that at the moment they're not being delivered. And what is absolutely key to this is farming policy. And we were asked to say something about what's happening elsewhere in Europe. On farming policy, the EU has consistently failed to reform the Common Agricultural Policy. The Farm to Fork programme for CAP reform looked like the most progressive reform of farming policy in the CAP for years. It was going to reduce output, reduce inputs, restore nature, etc., etc. And there's been a concerted effort by the farming lobby, talking about food security, talking about Ukraine, to kind of see that off. And the reform has been progressively diluted. And what you end up with, again, is a system which favours the bigger farmers and bigger landowners, and doesn't invest in the natural capital that we're all going to need for, oh my God, I'm out of time, and that we're going to need for long-term food security. And we risk having that in the UK as well if we don't really turn our focus on farm policy. And just the last point I make is that it really is possible to design a farming system that's going to increase the income of the smaller farmers by 1/5, improve diets, which we need to do for public health reasons, and enable us to meet our targets on net zero and nature. And I know that because Green Alliance has produced that policy and we're launching it at a conference on Tuesday. But just to talk airily about the need to support farmers, etc., without addressing which farmers you're going to support and to what end is not going to cut the mustard. And unless we get farming policy right, we'll really struggle with net zero and nature policies.
Very good.
That's brilliant, Shaun. Thank you. I think that what you said about nature and environmental quality as being sort of the utmost importance is really interesting, and also actually relates to some work that colleagues at the Fabian Society did, which showed that talking about nature and quality of life is one of the best arguments to persuade people who were sort of previously doubtful about climate action and the need for it. So just to hand over now to Fiona Harvey. Fiona is an environment editor at The Guardian. She previously wrote for the Financial Times and has covered the environment since 2004. She was also selected as the British Environment and Media Awards Journalist of the Year in 2007 and has twice won the Foreign Press Association Award for Environment Story of the Year. So it's great to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me this afternoon. I think it's clear that those of us who are in favour of climate action have won the rational argument for climate action, and I don't think there are any rational people left who don't think that we should be taking urgent steps to save our climate. What we need to care about now is the irrational side of this debate, and what we need to focus on for that is the language that we're using. As our chair has just said, I've written about this for 18 years, and I know that the language in which we frame this debate is absolutely crucial. We used to talk about global warming and climate change. Those sound quite nice. Now we're talking about the climate crisis, climate breakdown, climate catastrophe, because that really reflects what we're seeing in the world today and what we're facing. And when we use those words, people respond. We've seen examples of how the language can be weaponized in the climate debate by the right wing. Ed and I were at COP27 last November, and a wonderful thing happened there. We got this fund for loss and damage for developing countries, which is to help developing countries who are stricken by the horrible impacts of climate change, by hurricanes or storms or droughts or floods, to help them to rebuild their societies. What was that turned into by the right wing? Well, there was a huge headline in the Daily Mail saying reparations, £3 billion in reparations will be demanded from you for this. It's a distortion of the debate, but it's a term that was gifted to the right wing because there were young climate activists at COP27 using this term, talking about reparations, talking about compensation. It's stupid to use these terms and gift them to the right wing, who then use them to trigger responses, reflexive responses in people, bypassing their rational response. So in a spirit of openness and inclusion, I thought I'd give you a list of words that should be banned, that should be thrown in the bin and never used again, because they just trigger these responses. The first word to ban is the word ban, in fact, because when we tell people that we're banning things, we're stopping things, they turn off, they get alarmed. So we've been talking about things like banning gas boilers. Well, that's not helpful. We do need to move away from gas boilers, but I don't think most people care very much about how their house is heated, as long as they can afford it. It's not, which they can't at the moment, and as long as it's doing the job, as long as they're warm and comfortable. Similarly with gas cookers. There's a huge culture war brewing in the United States at the moment, where the right wing are saying, oh, they're coming for your gas cookers. I don't think people care what they cook their food on, as long as it's heated and, they can eat it. So we need to stop talking about banning things and moving to, say, switching to cleaner heating, switching to easier cooking. Use those terms instead. Similarly, people talk about eating less meat. We do need to eat less meat, but when you phrase it like that, people get a bit worried. They think they're going to be deprived. So instead, it's better to talk about adopting healthier diets or, eating higher quality food, or even use the word fresh. It's a wonderful word. Editors love it. And it's It is, and it's, if anything that is a policy that's been announced millions of times before, if you say it's fresh, that's great.
That's a good tip, Fiona, thanks.
So fresh food, I think, is the term to use here. Fresh everything is much better. Then, we also, I wince when I hear people talking about getting people out of their cars. We do need to stop driving so much, but a much better way of putting that is to talk about, say, public transport. People in this country actually like public transport. I was talking to someone in the United States who says the only people who use public transport there are the very old, the very poor, and the very drunk. That's not true here. People actually like trains and even buses. So the way to talk about this is not to say get people out of their cars, which sounds threatening to people, but to talk about how we need much better, more convenient, cheap, clean, reliable public transport, and how that makes your life easier. So I think it's really important here in this debate that we stop triggering these responses in people. If you say you're coming to take something away, the reflexive response that people have is to get more attached to it. That's an instinctive thing. And we just need to stop playing into the hands of the right wing who want to use those trigger responses to stymie any kind of climate action. Thanks.
That's great, Fiona. Thank you. It's so interesting to hear about how sort of like the power of language can hinder the climate debate. And I think that we'll all be taking notes as we go and write our reports or make our speeches. So next, we're going to go to Polly Billington. Polly is the CEO of UK 100, a network of local leaders who have pledged to lead a rapid transition to net zero in their communities. She established the organisation in 2016, but before that worked as a broadcast journalist for the BBC, and has also worked on several high-profile Labour Party selection campaigns, including Sadiq Khan's bid to be the Mayor of London. So over to you, Polly.
I did used to work for Ed as well, just full transparency. I don't know how that came off my CV. That's definitely somebody else's edit. I was invited here as Chief Executive of UK 100, but I'm on sabbatical from that role right now to take on an even huger task than getting local government to make the most of their powers to shift to net zero, and that is seeking to be Labour's parliamentary candidate for South Thanet. Thank you. Why do I tell you this at the beginning of my remarks? Because the man who holds that seat right now denies that climate change exists, is pro-fracking, anti-onshore wind, pro-oil and gas. This is a man with his face firmly towards the past and with no vision whatsoever for his constituency or the country, what it can and should be. That man is Craig McKinley. He chairs the Net Zero Scrutiny Group. Now, somebody said to me the other day, the Net Zero Scrutiny Group has only Craig McKinley left. Don't worry about them. The rest of them are ministers. Now, I would say to you, that suggests to me that this is absolutely an existential threat to exactly what we're talking about. The whole aim of that group is to undermine the efforts this country makes to net zero, challenging the science, spreading misinformation about the costs, the technologies, and questioning the economic and social benefits that can be that can exist as a result of good climate policy. Now, make no mistake about it, when people say that net zero is in the bricks of British institutions, they are very, very wrong. Any slight slippage in our relentless prosecution of a progressive agenda on climate will be seen as a win by him and his cronies. Now, if I'm selected, the battle there will be ground zero for net zero. We need to make sure that everybody is ready for that fight, because without it, there is a real risk that we continue to have a government which doesn't really take the climate crisis seriously. I believe it is a fight we can win, and Ed and the front bench have made enormous strides to be able to make this a reality. But I also urge Ed and the other front benchers to make sure that this offer is real. Make it crunchy. Make this the campaign that will bind together the Greens, people who would vote Green, and the disillusioned Boris voters to get us that electoral win and the mandate we need for a climate programme we can be proud of. Now, Rachel's speech this morning was absolutely, I never thought I'd hear a Labour Chancellor, Shadow Chancellor speak like that. It's absolutely transformative from the times when Ed and I were managing to just about get cleaner gas boilers through on the financial stimulus back in 2008. That was a tough push up the hill from all the reasons Ed has said about the nature of the Treasury. But the context now needs to be that the path to Parliament, to a government, is through places like South Thanet. So that's the context. There are more than a third of the children in that constituency living in poverty. And the sicknesses of poverty are very visible, with high levels of obesity in children and adults. 20% of households are in fuel poverty before the energy price spike. Low skills, low-skilled jobs, poor connectivity, you name it. You know what? The Fabians have already named the seats like this and the communities like this. It's the sea wall, and we need to breach it. Now, the problems are shared with many other places, and we need to be able to understand that this has to be a national mission. The last thing we need to do is to segment the country. We need to be able to bring it together on the things that really everybody has in common. And I think Ed's right about hope. People can only truly see that hope has some chance of being able to thrive if they have security. And security from so many different sides is really under threat in the precariousness of people's lives in places like South Thanet. That's a precariousness of finances and of the household. But it's also the precariousness of being able to get on. It's a precariousness of poor housing. It's a precariousness of a good job. It's a precariousness of a climate crisis. All of those precariousnesses we need to be able to offer an alternative with. So I've got a few suggestions before we finish. These are crunchy and I think will make a real difference, not only on the doorstep, but to transforming and making sure that we've got a delivery. We've promised 19 million homes to be retrofitted. I believe we should be making a comfy homes guarantee so that everybody can have that, and it's comfy, not just cosy, because we're talking about overheating homes already. That speaks to a public health demand. Housing has always been seen as a public health issue by good progressives. That's actually where we need to be. It also creates a signal to the market, creates a supply chain, demands the skills we need, and gives us an opportunity to be able to kickstart a whole industry. And we've talked about that Take Back Control Bill. That Take Back Control Bill, which was absolutely crucial for communities like Thanet, where actually at the moment local government coordination doesn't really work in order to be able to empower people. We need to make sure that there are net zero local powers embedded in that Take Back Control Bill, facilitating inclusive economic growth, community wealth building, strong local governance for energy, transport and planning, so that we can design those net zero communities and build that economy. And finally, integrate the adaptation dimension. This goes to some of the things that Shaun was talking about. Climate change is already happening. If a bridge goes down in a remote community, that completely screws the economy, not just for the weekend while you see the pictures on the telly, but for years afterwards. That is already a consequence in this country, and we need to be making sure that we have got a proper integrated plan to be able to support it, including nature-based solutions and nature restoration, but retrofit to deal with existing climate change, as I say, cooling as well as heating, protecting our existing infrastructure, those bridges I talked about, and building resilient new stuff, including homes. So always, I will say, don't focus on the doom and gloom. Always, I will remind people it's happening here rather than elsewhere. And always, I will remind people that we need to make sure that people feel they're powerful, not powerless, about harnessing politics to be able to tackle the realities of science. This is possible. It requires a radical and progressive electoral platform and a commitment to deliver. Woo.
Brilliant, thank you, Polly. And I think your cosy homes policy sounds brilliant, and particularly in the context of the recent energy crisis. I think it's something that we're all thinking about as the price of heating our homes goes through the roof, and we need to think about how we can do that so that everyone has a comfortable place to live. So we're now going to go to a Q&A. I can see some of you already have your hands up, which is going to make it very hard for me to pick, but I'm going to try and get a spread across the room. If I could just ask that you keep them brief and also try and speak into the microphone just so that everyone can hear. So we're going to go to the woman in the red scarf at the front, the man in the yellow jumper at the back, and the woman in the red coat just right at the back over there. Great, thank you.
Thanks very much. Really fantastic contributions from the whole panel. I'm Liz Clements, a councillor in Birmingham. I'm really concerned about sewage outflow into our rivers and coasts. I went to a meeting of flood risk managers across the Midlands yesterday where I heard a presentation from Severn Trent where they said they were aiming for zero outflows of sewage in 2050. I want to know what we're going to do to regulate the private water industry and what are we going to do on environmental targets there. It's a real emergency.
Thank you.
Ewan McGahey, King's College London Law School. Thank you so much to all the panellists for really interesting contributions. I had a comment for Fiona and a question for Ed. Fiona, it sounds like a really interesting list of words. I'm reminded of Newt Gingrich in an article called Language, a Key Mechanism of Control for the Republican Party, where he basically said, avoid these words, use these ones instead. And Frank Luntz has done a lot of work on that. But I wanted to just add this about the language of bans. I think that you're right that you can turn it into something positive, like replace. But bans are really important. So we've got to ban the internal combustion engine, gas heating, and fossil fuel energy generation. That's about 80 or 90% of emissions. And the language of we're just going to stop it, there's good research showing that that galvanizes a political coalition. If you say we're going to regulate the problem, we're going to tax it to internalize the externality, it doesn't galvanize the political clarity that you need in order to get the action. But absolutely right, better to say replace and so on. Fergus Green at UCL has done some good work on that, anti-fossil fuel norms. And Ed, the question for you, if I may, is can you say a little bit more about what GB Energy would actually look like? So there's the grid, and I understand it's not that. There's the retail companies, distribution. I understand it's not so much about that. I gather it's mainly about a public sector generator of energy. But if you could just say a little bit more about how far it goes, that would be really interesting.
Hi, Jay Morton. I'm an architect. I've also founded the non-official Architects for Labour. So my question is about, thank you. My question is about construction. To get to where we want to be will obviously require a lot of building, and obviously we need to provide a lot of new housing. Currently, construction consumes about 38% of global emissions, and obviously we are making headway in terms of operational carbon, but really not a lot is being done in terms of embodied carbon. And our construction industry in the UK particularly really lags behind in terms of innovation. And this is partly due to cost, lack of testing and new details, and also lack of regulation in terms of embodied carbon. So my question is, what would a Labour government do to ensure we have a resilient green construction industry fit for the future?
That's brilliant. Thanks for those questions. I'm going to go to Ed first, and you can answer the one that's sort of more specifically for you on GB Energy as well, but also have a go at the others. So just to repeat the questions, we had one that was on sewage outflows and what are we going to do to regulate the private water industry. One for Ed about the detail of GB Energy and what that will look like, and then one about the sort of emissions in the construction space. So again, if you could sort of keep it to a couple of minutes so that we can sum up, that would be great. Thank you.
I'll try and be sort of brief. Ewan, on that question on GB Energy, so you're completely right. It's focused on this issue of generation, and what we've done is we've looked at the 10 most successful countries for renewable energy generation across the world. 9 of them have publicly owned generating companies. One of them doesn't. Well, that one of them is the UK. Why do these countries have these publicly owned generation companies? I think essentially it comes down to industrial policy, and that's something I know you're very interested in and you work on. This is about how do you drive jobs and wealth in your own country. And, you know, things like Ørsted in Denmark, in fact, the Danish climate envoy said to me, yes, we've got your jobs when it comes to offshore wind. I mean, just to say, 45% of our offshore wind assets are owned by foreign governments, not foreign companies, foreign governments. And so this is about, and you know, if you talk to many of the trade unions, they'll say, yeah, we're in favour of green jobs, but promises have been made over the last decade and they haven't been delivered. So we've got the generation, but we don't have the jobs. So this is fundamentally about industrial policy. It's also about delivering our 2030 target. We're working on a prospectus for GB Energy. The focus will be on, it's really on probably around in particular around new technologies, whether that's green hydrogen or floating wind or tidal power, to give Britain the kind of competitive lead in this area. And it complements our National Wealth Fund, which will be investing in gigafactories. People have seen the fiasco of British Volt. You know, we had a roundtable with Lou Haig on with the car industry this week. You know, we are falling behind when it comes to batteries. This is about, and gigafactories, this is about a proper industrial policy so that we can take advantage of the green economy. And just last thing I'll say on this, you know, I noticed Grant Shapps at Davos complaining about the Inflation Reduction Act and saying how unfair it was. I mean, I think it says quite a lot that you've got a government that doesn't think, well, we've got to have our own industrial policy. They just want to complain about others having one. And you know, this is really very, very serious because, you know, Cllr puts it very well. You know, some country is going to take the lead in these green technologies, and it should be us. Last thing I'll say just quickly on sewage. Jim McMahon, my colleague at DEFRA, has set a target to get rid of 90% of sewage outflows by 2030. You're completely right. We can't wait till 2050.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to go backwards this time, so I'll go to Polly first, if that's all right.
Thanks very much. I totally share your concerns about the water. It's absolutely extraordinary, the kind of complacency that this government has about the state of our water. You know, Thanet's surrounded on three sides by water. No, people live there in order to be able to enjoy the sea. They can't enjoy the sea because there's raw sewage in it. You know, that is a genuine anxiety for lots of people. We need to be sending the offending bosses to jail. That's it. I mean, we can spend... If they don't do what is needed to clean up our water and invest in the system so our water is safe, they shouldn't be in charge of our water. It's a strange... Well, and they certainly oughtn't to be getting bonuses of 2 million. Let's also be clear. I think it might be very tempting to want to seize the assets, but I think it would be expensive. I think there are other ways of dealing with this. If you think about it, most of our water is owned by foreign sovereign wealth funds. Do you want to give loads of money to those people? No, I don't think so either. I think it would be better to fine them and then jail them. Because I'm absolutely serious about this. This is the legislation we will need. Water is so fundamental to life. They're abusing it and they're trying to fob us off with, oh, it's really difficult. It's not difficult, it's your job. Do it or go to jail.
Brilliant, thanks, Polly. Fiona, do you have anything on any of the questions to answer? Okay, in that case, we can go to Shaun.
Two things. On the construction issue, I don't think there is policy on it, which is why Green Alliance is trying to work some up. So let's have a chat. We've got a circular economy task force, which is looking at construction, circularity in construction. On water companies, I'm not going to get as big a round of applause for this, but I think Jim McMahon has got well worked up policies on the sewage aspect. The other 2/3 of water pollution is from farming runoff, and that's where you need policies.
Great. Kindy?
I'd just like to say a bit about the construction industry. I think that particularly around the ability for local councils to actually commission for great infrastructure projects. I think if we could have greater flexibility for local councils to do more things locally, to use local businesses, to use local construction companies, I think that goes a long way to the supply chain that I was talking about earlier, where we can use local talent, etc. I also think There's a particular project in just outside Vienna called Seestadt. It's a small town that's actually been developed from scratch, and the construction there has been done in conjunction with communities. So where communities actually decide what their kind of block of flats are going to be. So for example, where my sister-in-law lives, they decided that they wanted their block of flats to be passive house. There's also a community centre, there's a school that's been built, there's also businesses that have been encouraged to come and set up there, but not like in this country where, say, for example, you have Tesco's on a city centre high street that charges more money than those in other parts of the town. So I think what happens in Seestadt is that the Tesco, the equivalent of Tesco's, I don't know what it's called, has to charge the same amount of monies. So what I'm saying is that the construction industry cannot be separated out from what the kind of urban spaces that we want, where we want to live, etc., and how we want our children to grow up in, and how our senior people to live and feel that they are being valued.
Great, thank you. We've got time for one more quick round of questions. So I'm going to go to the man in the scarf at the back. And the woman on the right here.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to pick up on something that Fiona said in her opening statement about language, because I think that's incredibly important. I just wondered if the panel, particularly Ed and Polly and the Labour councillor, could say, how do we create an effective, engaging narrative around some of this stuff that brings working class people and working class communities along with us? Because at the moment, a lot of the things that we're talking about on the environmental policy and kind of like the green transition, a lot of our communities feel like they're under attack, especially communities like mine in Dagenham and Rainham. Cheers.
Councillor Debbie Andre on the Isle of Wight. In June of 2019, the Isle of Wight achieved biosphere status, UNESCO biosphere status, one of only 7 in the UK. As part of that, we've adopted the UNESCO's 17 sustainable goals because we need to have an action plan. And we've heard some great things, some great commitments and policy about net zero by 2030. Will Labour commit to using those 17 UNESCO sustainable goals to embed them to deliver on an action plan? It includes things on other subjects that we've heard, like gender equality and a quality education for all. Thank you.
Great. So that was one question on using language to persuade working class communities about climate change and ensure that they don't feel under attack. And then another question about the UNESCO sustainable goals. Would either sort of like Fiona or Ed maybe want to come in on that first question about the sort of language point?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a really important question that our colleague asked. I think just let me expand a little bit on what I said in the opening remarks. You know, take this issue of energy bills, and I think we shouldn't underestimate how hard this is to get across to people, because I think the basic default thought is, oh, well, if we go green, it'll be more expensive. You know, our plan to have zero carbon electricity by 2030 cuts bills by £93 billion between now and 2030. It's an average saving of £400 a year per household. So why don't we have this cheaper power which can save money for people? You don't need to sign people up to thinking the climate emergency is the biggest issue for them. You just need to sign people up to thinking there's a cost of living crisis and we'd like it tackled, please. And that's the start. And then if we insulate 19 million cold drafty homes, Polly's Cosy Homes guarantee, it will cut bills by somewhere between £500 and £1,000 for people. And that's just to sort of start with. And then you've got GB Energy, which will mean we have we generate sort of cheap renewable power in our country. So I think and then jobs is obviously part of it too, and energy security, not being reliant on Putin and so on. So I think it's you're absolutely right about this, and the way we've designed the policy and the way we try and talk about the policy is in the order of bills, security, jobs, climate, precisely to make sure that we appeal to as broad a cross-section of people, given the circumstances we're in, as possible.
Great. Holly, would you like to speak?
Yeah, can I add to that? This is a patriotic national mission, right? This isn't just about wrapping yourself in a Union Jack, right? This is about the love of our landscape. This is the love of our nature and transforming our attitude towards that as sometimes a little bit technocratic, a little bit urban, a little bit, I don't want to spend too much time in the countryside because it's a bit muddy, and actually realising that British people love their countryside, they love nature, wherever they're from and however, whichever class they're from. That is something that brings people together. We've got a real opportunity to start talking about this because it's about, and that's not, that interestingly, much less about the planet, much more about our countryside. And that gives us the opportunity, and our beautiful natural capital, right? However, some people don't like the word capital, it's actually their assets. We look after them. That's what we do because we care about them. What on earth are we doing leaving that in the hands of people who don't care about it, which is energy companies, water companies, etc. So think about this as a patriotic mission. And if any, I think Ed mentioned Rebecca Solnit. She's written a brilliant book. Now, it might seem a long way away from writing a leaflet for Dagenham, Andrew, but I'm sure you'll enjoy this, right? Read Rebecca Solnit's book on Orwell and Roses. It reminds you how important nature is actually to our country, our British and English progressive tradition. And we should really think about that when we're talking about this between ourselves and with our voters.
Great. Thank you, Polly. And Kindy?
Thank you. I think it depends who you're talking to, what the language you use. And I think for most of us, actually, the first thing I'd say is for us to get out from behind our laptops, go out into our communities. We have such communities in Coventry, for example, areas like Wood End, where all the shops are boarded up. They have no green spaces. The idea of countryside to them is just miles away, right? So it is about us just spending time with them, litter picking, having those conversations. What are your bills like? How are you getting your kids to school? Has the bus 21 come along recently? Because I know I had to wait 25 minutes before a bus came when I visited one school. And it's those sorts of conversations. And we have to have, when I was talking earlier about those different dialogues, so I know that many communities, where you, say for example, you form a relationship or you form a marriage through family connections, and those connections extend the other side of the globe. And the people get quite nervous when conversations around flying miles and this kind of thing. And somebody once said to me, well, flying isn't a right. Well, if all your family connections are in this country, if you've got family, like my mum came to this country when she was 15. Her dad, her mum, her great-grandfather, who came to this country before the Second World War, they all lived there when she was here at 15 as a married woman, right, as a married woman. So it was important. I think those sorts of connections we need to consider as part of this debate, because not everybody just has their connections in this country. And that if you come to this country through marriage, for example, you will still want to retain those connections. And when we talk about social care, for example, adult social care, I actually think that should be part of the infrastructure of the economy as well, because not everybody's parents live in this country. Yes, and so somebody like my mum who had to travel abroad to look after her mum at various times. So those are some of the realities. So the narratives that we have to be targeted, and we have to have that dialogue rather than just a narrative, because narrative says, I'm telling you, you listen to me, and it doesn't work like that. We have to have conversation to find out exactly what people's lives are like and what they're experiencing and what they want in life. And that's what I think.
Great, thank you. And then last, if I could just go to Shaun, if you wanted to come in on either of those two questions.
No, well, the only thing I would say is that when Green Alliance has run citizens' juries, the really important message that's come across is that if you're going to have change, it needs to be fair. And we had a citizens' jury in Cardiff where people who hardly ever flew were against the frequent flyer levy because they knew people who did, or they thought it was stifling aspiration or whatever, but they also thought we were expanding Heathrow, the the Prime Minister was taking short flights, or it wasn't actually, it was a while ago, but, you know, they wanted it to be absolutely fair, and then they would accept it. And there wasn't that sense that climate policies that were going to enforce behaviour change on them were also going to lead to behaviour change for others.
Great, thank you. I think that's all that we have time for, but thank you so much for attending. This is obviously a vital issue, and our panel are doing really good work on it, but we also need to keep up the momentum ourselves in our communities, in our CLPs, workplaces, etc. You can also join the Fabian Society today if you're not already a member, I have to say that, by clicking join on our website. And if you're already a member, you can get more involved, sign up to different policy networks and groups. And you can also tweet about the event using the hashtag FEPSFabian 2023. So thank you so much for coming, and thanks so much to all of our panel who have been brilliant.